take the time to look up and down Main Street, look up at the windows that exist along Main Street. You'll find names up there, proprietors, people with interesting businesses, all kinds of different things that happen that are references to people who were in the history of the Walt Disney Company, who were instrumental in building the Magic Kingdom and the Walt Disney World Resort. So what I'd like to do over the next couple of videos is go through and talk about the people that you see on these windows. So let's start over here with the Town Square Theater and work our way up Main Street. We'll get to Center Street, and that'll be part one. A couple of quick caveats about the windows on Main Street. These have been there since 1971. Sometimes they're down for repairs. They're otherwise obscured. Sometimes they've moved or otherwise changed. It does happen. And when I'm giving you an overview of who the person is, sometimes I can't find the biography of that person. So just bear with me. Before heading up Main Street, I wanted to take a moment and pay homage to George Kalogridis, who was the president of the Walt Disney World Resort for many years, who retired in 2022. His window may change, but for now, it's there. The first window we come to is Fashions by John Designs, hem stitching and pin coating. And this has everything to do with costuming at Walt Disney World. Now, when it first opened, it didn't have 100,000 cast members, but certainly there were a large number who needed to be costumed and outfitted. So entered Ken Creekmore, who was responsible for the overall process of making sure that every cast member had costumes and making sure that this was well thought out. Then you had a couple of other people who were involved in the designs. Tom Pierce actually drew up most of the costumes and made sure that we had designs for each of the costumes for each land in each area. And then there's Orpha Harriman, who was responsible for creating the actual costumes, and she actually worked on It's a Small World as well in costuming there. So she oversaw the stitching and designs and actual work to create these. And then you had Aaliyah Paskaviskis, who was responsible for making sure that everything got sewn and was available in wardrobe to be handed out. And then finally you had John Keane, whose family was in the garment business, so he was really responsible for making sure that the whole focus was done and that everything was procured that they needed. Now, there was a funny story about a sixth name appearing on a window, and it turned out to be a painter who saw that there was an empty space and painted his own name in there, and it stayed up there for more than 10 years. On the other side is the Town Square Tailor, Tailors to the President, with Bob Phelps. Now, Bob Phelps, he was more responsible for making sure that the operation ran smoothly, that they could get the wardrobe out to cast members and do everything right. So this was the overall operation of creating all of the costumes and making sure that everything happened. So his job was really about costuming, and he had a big role in creating this book, Costuming at Disney. Next up is a trio of windows. The first says, State Licensed and Bonded Bill Irwin Field Calculations, Larry Reiser Synchronizer. The second says, Construction Company, General Contractor Pete Markham, and Engineer. And the third one reads, Schedules Changed While You Wait, Francis Stanek Prognostications, and Dan Dingman Reckoning. These are all key people in the Buena Vista Construction Company, which is primarily responsible for the building of the entirety of the Walt Disney World Resort. There isn't a whole lot of record-keeping publicly about Bill Irwin, other than the fact he was a construction manager and was an executive within the Buena Vista Construction Company. What we know about Larry Reiser is he was involved day-to-day in the operations, dealing with a lot of the contract companies and so forth that were working there, and he also worked on the Haunted Mansion. Pete Markham was one of the first people hired to work on the construction project. He was an engineer, he was the overall project manager, and he made sure that everything got done. Francis Stanek's role was to be involved as a comptroller, really understanding the financials and ensuring that the project continued on schedule and on budget. Dan Dingman is grouped with Stanek because he was the person who did most of the financial estimating on what it would cost to do the overall construction. And as you may notice, right next to them is General Joe's building permits, General Joe Potter's window to the world. General Potter, of course, was the person who was most closely tied to the entirety of the Walt Disney World project. Without him, it never would have come to fruition, so he has a place of honor. And yes, it says General Joe's Raconteur. One of the more interesting things is that on the third story of a few of the buildings, there's some windows up there as well, but they're reserved for very specific people. In this case, we see Roy O. Disney, Walt's brother, who was responsible for making sure that the Walt Disney World Resort came together after Walt's death. It's located above the confectionery and looks down on the space where Roy gave his dedication speech. That's why it's important. It says if we can dream it and we can do it, and Dreamers and Doers Development Corporation, though he never actually said if we can dream it, we can do it. But still, the sentiment is right. The next set of 3 windows starts with Doug CAYNE, delineator. Our motto, a straight line is the first rule, with associates Joe Kramer and George WINDRUM. Then there's Drafting Corporation, which provided the design, drafting, and graphic design services to construction at Walt Disney World. And the third window says associates Ron BOWMAN, Glenn DURFLINGER, Don HOLMQUIST, and George Nelson. All of these people were WED designers. Doug CAYNE was an art director and worked on Tomorrowland and Space Mountain, and later on Spaceship Earth. Joe Kramer was an architect who worked on the original Epcot model and also did a lot of the architectural designs for Walt Disney World. George WINDRUM was an Imagineer who did show set designs. In fact, he ran the show set design department at WED, creating work drawings for the interiors of many rides, including the Haunted Mansion. Ron BOWMAN was an architect and project designer for Walt Disney. He worked for the company for around 25 years and later designed a couple of pavilions at Epcot. Glenn DURFLINGER may not be as well known as the other Imagineers, but he designed Cinderella's Castle and a number of other attractions around the Walt Disney World Resort. Don HOLMQUIST was an architect and made ideas. He designed the American Adventure Pavilion and worked on Epcot Center for a long period of time. Dick Klein was an Imagineering architect and designed Fort Wilderness. And George Nelson was a prolific design lead who designed most of the things that you see in Tomorrowland. And now we move on to more of the people that you might know as Imagineers. The Hollywood Publishing Company, Manuscripts and Melodramas, F.X. Atencio, Albertino, and Marty Sklar. X. Atencio, of course, is prolific. He did everything related to the Pirates of the Caribbean that you know today, including the theme song. Albertino was responsible for a large portion of the Country Bear Jamboree, and Big Al was sort of modeled after him. And then there's Marty Sklar, who became the director of Imagineering at some point in time and really took over as one of the lead designers for Disney and had the close connection to Walt Disney himself. And now we move on to talk about 2 windows that represent the lighting and sound work that was done at the Magic Kingdom. The first is Graphics Complete, Catalog of Brochures, Every Document, C. Robert Moore and Norm Nocetti, Layouts on Request. The second is the Safe and Sound Amplification Company, Gordon Williams and Ed Chisholm. Bob Moore created a lot of the drawings of what we see at the Walt Disney World Resort, and he most famously did the Walt Disney stamp. And by the way, the MD is a self-acclaimed moniker that means Mickey Drawing. Norm Nocetti was a creative designer and a creative director around the Walt Disney World Resort. Gordon Williams is probably best known for all of the sound effects and the audio animatronic sync-ups that happened at the Haunted Mansion. So next time you're there, you'll think of him. Ed Chisholm was a manufacturing engineer who worked for WDI and created a lot of the props that we see today. Tucked up in the corner, right behind the tree, is another window that says Hyperion Film and Camera Exchange, world's largest film library, screenings daily at 4 p.m. The 5 people listed all worked at Hyperion Studios, which was Walt Disney's original studio, so it's kind of a nice nod to them. They all went on to help with various aspects of drawings related to the Walt Disney World Resort. They were kind of recruited into business there. So when you look at the names, it's Dick Fowler, Bob Gabault, McLaren Stewart, Bill Bosch, and Jack Boyd. I have a few pictures of some of them from around various activities when they're working at the Hyperion Studios, just to give you a sense of who they were. Next up is a window that's dedicated to a couple of Imagineers. It's called Buena Vista Magic Lantern Slides. Treat your friends to our special tricks. And it's got a few Imagineers listed there. Of course, these are people who worked for WED and were part of the Imagineering group. Next up is YALE GRACEY. YALE was a pioneer in creating visual spaces with props and other lighting effects to make something really spectacular. He's most remembered for the Haunted Mansion and has a tombstone there as well. Next up is Bud Martin, who worked on a number of attractions around the Walt Disney World Resort when they were first being constructed. Ken O'Brien did a number of different things, including the Pirates of the Caribbean, the Hall of Presidents, and the Country Bear Jamboree. Wathel Rogers is best known as the father of audio animatronics. Yep, he invented that technology and perfected it. And then we have Sawyer Fence Painting, with Tom Nabby as the proprietor of this in Anaheim and in Lake Buena Vista. The thing about Tom Nabby is he looked a little bit like Tom Sawyer, and so Walt hired him to play that part, and then ultimately he grew into the company and became the monorail operations director in Walt Disney World. Before I move on, I wanted to point out there's one more window here that's kind of obscured. It has 3 names on it, though you can really only see 2 if you look carefully. The first name on it is James Pasilla. He was the head of human resources and the person who did all the casting for the parks. Tom Eastman headed up Disney University, or the training arm that became part of Traditions. And Pat Vaughn was the head of employee relations. We move on to 2 windows related to operations. The first is the Main Street Diary, True Tales of Inspiration, with Lee A. Cockerell as the editor-in-chief. And then there's B. Laval, What We Build Together Can Last Forever, Partners in Planning. Lee Cockerell was the executive vice president of the Walt Disney World Resort when it first opened, and he stayed there for around 20 years. He oversaw everything, including the 40,000 cast members and all of the operations. Bruce Laval was an industrial engineer who was the executive vice president over operations and planning for the parks and introduced the term of guestology. You might say that he's the reason why we feel the magic when we go to the parks. There's a little window that pays tribute to 3 other Imagineers, and it's kind of nondescript in a way. They don't get the same attention that some of the other ones do, but each of these was an important person in the WED operations unit and caused some portion of Walt Disney World to happen. First up on the list is Jack Fergus. Jack was instrumental in making drawings and dioramas that were used to create the Walt Disney World Resort. Next up was Fred Yorger, and Fred was responsible for creating many of the models that were used in designing the park itself. Often regarded as the forgotten Imagineer, Mitz was a person who had been relegated to a lot of menial tasks because of his ancestry, but he was responsible for many of the models that we see around the Magic Kingdom and how the Magic Kingdom got built out. Interestingly, on the other side of that same window, you have Bob Sewell, Counselor, and Malcolm Cobb listed there. They're also Imagineers, just like the other 3. And the 2 of them created a number of different miniatures and actually worked on a number of the attractions around the park. So you have Bob Sewell, who was responsible for creating some of the attractions, and you have Malcolm Cobb, who was also involved in the similar activities. Next to that, you have the Cat Gallery, where they're exhibiting only authentic works of genuine antiques. This is a tribute to Walt's younger daughter, Sharon, and her husband, William Lund, and their 3 children. So it's kind of a nice tribute to that part of the family. Since Walt had died, it was kind of a fitting way to pay tribute to his daughter. And that brings us to Center Street and the end of this particular video. But there'll be more. We'll talk about other people who were responsible for Walt Disney World.